Hi there, I'm Doug Furr, author of the Eruption universe and related works, and welcome to my channel. The following video is going to be narrated by a text-to-speech engine. I suffer from a speech impediment which makes it very difficult for me to read off script without either stuttering, or repeating over myself, as you just saw right there. The text-to-speech engine is made using my own voice, and the content that the text-to-speech engine will be narrating is entirely my own and not AI generated. I think it's possible to say no to things like AI generated slop and environmental destruction while also saying yes to the careful use of technology that helps people with disabilities communicate and lead a more fulfilling life. I appreciate you approaching my videos with an open mind, and I hope you enjoy the show. Thank you for watching.
Eruption Part 2: The Aftermath in the United States. Quick editor's note before we get started. Going forward, these articles are going to all build on each other. They will be written with the assumption that the listener/reader has already been through all the previous essays. I'm going to try to avoid repeating information for the sake of clarity, but I may reiterate something if it is critical to understanding the current essay. Thanks. So as I've mentioned, most of the central United States had been utterly decimated by the eruption. We can consider the following states to have been completely depopulated, less than 2% of total population surviving, with all major settlements and infrastructure destroyed: Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Utah, New Mexico, and Colorado. The following states suffered major population loss, greater than 50%, and also suffered total social collapse: Arizona, Nevada, North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Kansas. The next group of states also suffered major population loss, between 25 and 75%, but had large population centers far enough away from the eruption that there was some continuity of government. However, their western regions were still uninhabitable and impassable: Texas, Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, and Louisiana. The remaining states east of the Mississippi River were mostly spared the immediate effects of Yellowstone, but they still suffered from the effects of volcanic winter and unrest in the years to come. I'm going to be glossing over the West Coast, Alaska, and Hawaii for now, as I'm going to be going over their stories in much greater detail later on. The federal government had no unified response to a disaster of this scale. This was partially due to science not having a thorough understanding of Yellowstone in the 1980s, and even many experts were caught off guard by the sheer magnitude of the blast. FEMA had been founded just 6 years earlier, and let's be frank, it has never had the resources to deal with a disaster of this scale, to say nothing of the state-level organizations. The entirety of the executive and legislative branches had relocated to a secure location, assumed to be Mount Weather, the Greenbrier, and/or Raven Rock. While they had attempted to govern from these underground facilities, with such massive disruptions to the power and fuel infrastructure, there was simply no one to hear them. Survivors from the West began moving eastward towards the Mississippi, desperate for food, water, and power. Soon impromptu refugee camps began sprouting up on the banks of the river. Again, lacking organization, they soon became overrun with filth, disease, and unrest. By the end of January 1986, power had begun to be restored east of the Appalachian Mountains, and the true scope of the disaster had become apparent. It was at this point that the federal government realized that if the United States was to survive at all, they would need to consolidate their power in the eastern states. In the most controversial decision since the Civil War, Congress passed the Life Raft Act, which effectively declared that all U.S. territory west of the 93rd Meridian West to be stripped of statehood and reverted to territory status, quote, until such time that the Congress can exercise its authority over the devastated regions, which shall be henceforth be known as the Eruption Zone, and that, quote, priority for relief and restorative funding shall be given to the surviving states, and only when the surviving states are restored to pre-disaster standards of living shall funding be given to the West. The act was signed into law by the President February 1st, 1986, after which he gave a televised address to the nation. Having just gotten their power back, the president's speech explaining the Life Raft Act was the first thing many Americans had heard from the federal government regarding the eruption. This understandably caused even more unrest in the refugee camps and those who had sheltered in place in the eruption zone. The National Guard was deployed not to hand out food and water, but to quell the riots and clear out the refugee camps. Thousands would be killed as they clashed with the Guard, yet the unrest continued. Eventually, armor and aircraft were brought in as those who had still not fled back into the eruption zone were systematically massacred. It is worthy of mention that there were some National Guardsmen who believed the orders to open fire on fellow Americans to be illegal and refused to follow them. Anyone who refused the orders were immediately arrested and court-martialed. This in turn caused many more Guardsmen to simply desert their posts and join the refugees fleeing west back into the eruption zone, where many would live as outlaws or continue fleeing west to the west coast. Most of those who were taken into custody were ultimately found not guilty during their court-martials, as it was determined that the orders to open fire on fellow Americans was certainly questionably legal at best. By mid-April, the violence had ceased, and the ash in the atmosphere had dissipated enough that HF radio and satellite communication could be used to contact the West Coast. The president broadcasted a televised speech to the West Coast, where he again explained the Life Raft Act, although this time he included more neoconservative and political talking points, such as the infamous lines, "Allowing the government to meddle in the rebuilding efforts in the West will do nothing but increase bureaucracy and ultimately the cost of rebuilding. Furthermore, it will lead to a culture of dependence on government institutions and an addiction to spending other people's money to solve your problems." We will go more in depth into the aftermath of the speech, but suffice to say, the West didn't appreciate it one bit. The destruction of the Midwest severely impacted the food supply of not just the United States, but the entire world. Thankfully, much of the corn and grain harvest of 1985 had already been shipped east. However, much of the fertile Great Plains had been buried under ash and volcanic rock, severely reducing arable land going forward. Thousands upon thousands of livestock would perish in the disaster, and again, with nowhere to graze or grow fodder, these numbers would not recover. Furthermore, the U.S. no longer could receive food shipments from the fertile regions of California or the waters of the Pacific, further reducing the available food supply. Food shortages across the remaining states would become commonplace. Food exports from the U.S. would cease entirely, driving up global food prices. Let's go over the numbers and what the effects on the U.S. population would be going forward. At the end of 1985, the U.S. population was approximately 237.9 million. Looking at the populations of the states mentioned earlier, we can say around 40 million were killed either instantly during the eruption or in the immediate aftermath. There were also approximately 35 million living on the West Coast, who mostly survived, but would no longer be part of the United States. This brings the U.S. population down to about 162.9 million, roughly 70% of what it was pre-eruption. Thousands more would perish in the following years due to long-term health effects of the eruption, food insecurity, or additional unrest in the eruption zone. This would have a dramatic effect on the birth rate, and by 2017, the U.S. population would only be around 180 to 200 million. Of course, the U.S. would no longer be the economic superpower it had been in the Cold War either. Most industries would come to a standstill, services would cease, and the financial sector would become irrelevant for a time. The U.S. chose to invest the resources it had into restarting business, rather than helping the population, and the economy did start to show signs of recovery by 1990. Still, without much of its territory and two-thirds the population, the U.S. economy would remain stagnant throughout the 1990s and 2000s, and wouldn't even have close to the economy it is in the real world. We also have to consider that without the West Coast, the U.S. would no longer have easy access to the Pacific, and thereby reducing trade with East Asia, that conversely, the West Coast nations would now have. And also, the tech boom of the 90s centered in Silicon Valley would not contribute to the American economy either, and also would boost that of the West Coast. By 2017, the US GDP would remain around $4.34 trillion, roughly what it was in 1985. After running the numbers, this shakes out to an average GDP per capita in 2017 of about $21,700, roughly equivalent to Croatia, Poland, Antigua, or Oman. Not a bad standard of living. The average American certainly wouldn't live in poverty, but they're not rich either. So I think that's where we'll end it for today. I will definitely do another episode in the future dealing with the political situation in the US from the 90s onward, as well as the current state of the US Armed Forces, as of 2017 in universe. The main thing I want to impress upon the reader is that the United States in Eruption is very different from the United States in the real world. The prosperity of the 1950s and 60s would be a distant memory, as would the very concept of sea to shining sea. Instead, we see a failing nation that is desperately trying to cling to some semblance of power while enduring a bleak volcanic winter, and it is their own population that is suffering the most from it. Until next time, Doug Furr.